All right, good morning, everyone. How are you all?
Good morning. Awesome.
Good, good. Well, I'm happy to be with you be here with you this morning. My name is Dan. I came down from Danvers to be with you today. So right next door to Salem, the real Salem village. I am during the school year a high school teacher, which means that in the summer I am around on Monday mornings like this, which is always nice to do a different kind of history talk. I had written a book a couple years ago about Rebecca Nurse, who's one of the victims of the 1692 Salem Village witch hunt. And that'll be our topic this morning. I mean, the witch hunt in general as well. Rebecca Nurse in particular. And I would say from the start, at the end, please ask any questions that you might have. I have found that whenever I go different places and talk about the witch hunt, people tend to have tons of questions. So that is good. That is encouraged. That's always good to hear. With our talk this morning about Rebecca Nurse, as you could probably imagine, there are... can you hear me in the back? Okay. Should I be louder? Okay.
A little bit more, that'd be great.
I will. Excellent. So with the witch hunt overall, it is really a bizarre, an interesting, a fascinating, and a tragic event in early American history. It's one of those events that, as I think of like students in school learning about American history, we don't really talk much about the 1600s. It's all, the American Revolution is the big part. What we talk about is the early settlers, maybe like Plymouth 1620, and then the witch trials. So it's kind of those two early events in American history that people hone in on. With that, there are so many books about the Salem witch hunt out there. I mean, one could not imagine. God, I own too many, I'm sure. But there are so many. There are great ones. There are excellent ones that take different perspectives, sort of try to analyze different things. And what I had come across when reading about this topic is that there was something missing. There are absolutely enormously thick books that try to cover the entire event. And on the one hand, you can try, but you really can't. This event lasts really only about 8 or 9 months, but during this time, you have almost 200 people accused of witchcraft. You have 19 hanged, 1 pressed to death, at least 5 die in jail. It covers not just Salem Village, what's now Danvers, or the city of Salem, but the whole North Shore and beyond. The furthest accused south is Charlestown, north is Maine, which was still Massachusetts back then, and then west goes out to Billerica. It's an enormous event, and you can't have one book and actually understand all of these characters. What I found was missing is the idea of, if you write about 200 people, they're just a number. You don't actually get to understand like someone's story. So when I wanted to explore this, I wanted a biography and I wanted one person. So you can see how like a person's life is actually affected by this. There were no standalone biographies of any of the victims of the witch hunt prior to this, which was very surprising to me because it's a well-known event in American history. So that was sort of my reason for doing this. As I mentioned, I live in Danvers. I grew up down the street from the Rebecca Nurse homestead, her home that still exists, right down the road from the other monuments to victims of the witch hunt. So to me, this is local history. It is my town. Nurse herself, we'll talk about Salem Village, but her story begins much earlier than this. In 1692, she is 71. She's at that point in time, one of the older people in her community, and her story begins far away from Massachusetts. She's born in England, moreover the far side of England, facing the English Channel. She grows up in a community that has a lot of strife, a lot of turmoil, primarily religious reasons. I do know that I am down here closer to Plymouth, which I'm sure is a topic more familiar with you, the idea of the dissenters, the Church of England, and we could say not seeing eye to eye would be a very polite way to put it. Just as the separatist clique came to Plymouth, Rebecca Nurse grew up in a similar Puritan household, and they will come to Massachusetts, come to Salem, because of their disputes with the king and the Church of England. She'll come over when she's about 14. We don't have the record of what ship, what day it pulled into Salem. in part because a lot of the Puritans actually weren't allowed to leave. And so there's a reason their name was never written down, because they did not show up legally, which is just very common for the 1630s. The king didn't like the Puritans, but he also didn't want them to leave, which is a weird sort of policy to have. So we know just from other records that her parents, her siblings arrive about 1635. We know that they live in the Northfields area of Salem. This is downtown Salem, if you will. So it's across the North River. It's purely farmland. Rebecca's maiden name is Towne, Towne. So she lives with the Towne family in the Northfields. Eventually, she's going to marry a guy named Francis Nurse, which is why she is Rebecca Nurse, of course. We really don't know a lot about Francis. The Towne family has multiple people involved in the witch hunt, and it's a family that's been very well researched. The genealogy has been done. There's a big association of people who are descended from Rebecca Nurse and her siblings. Excellent genealogical research. Francis Nurse just kind of shows up in Salem. We don't know where he came from. We don't really know much about him. He showed up as a teenager, and we know that he was rather not well off. Our first record is he was stealing food. So that is where he first appears in American documents. They eventually get married. They'll rent somewhere in downtown Salem. Then they'll move out west of Salem to what's today the city of Peabody. It was still Salem back then. I don't know if you've ever driven 128 north when it gets to Peabody and there's the giant split. Their farm is like the center of that split, was their original one. Nothing of that one exists today. It's like the Salem Country Club now. It's a golf course. I hate to use a highway as like a landmark for a historic site. It seems very wrong to me. They lived out there for several years. They're going to have 8 kids. And so far, nothing in our story is like super exciting or different or weird, or it's very normal. They were good Puritans. They had established themselves in the community. Rebecca, in particular, became an important member of the Puritan Church. Almost everybody would have attended the Puritan Church, but only about 10% of the people who showed up every Sunday were given the status of a full member of the church. You had to be voted in. And they only voted you in if, according to the Puritan beliefs, they thought you were going to heaven. Rebecca Nurse is one of those 10%. So clearly a very respected person in the town, good reputation. Everything seems to be going well. When they'd lived out in these farms, they're only renting. And of course, the dream of anybody who had come to Massachusetts from England is to be a landowner. So her and her husband, they hear about a deal that they can move up to Salem Village. Salem Village is within this black-lined area that today is Danvers, and that's Middleton. I'm a technological master, so I have little blue lines to tell you. Inside here is Danvers today. So it's basically Salem Village. I mean, that's where the core of it was. So they hear about a land deal. There's someone selling a 300-acre farm, which is big. There were plenty of others that big at that point in time, but still big. And they talk with them, and it is right over here, right sort of not too far over the line into the village. And they are going to get an amazing deal on this farm. The previous owner really wants to just cash out and sell and move on. He had some issues in the community prior. He also lives in Boston and just owns this farm, like an entire day's walk out here. Like, he's not ever there. He just wants to get rid of it. They get a mortgage with no money down, tiny payments, and they get credit for like clearing new fields on the land and such. It's like a dream. Nobody could ever get this good of a deal. And again, mentioning Francis Nurse, clearly started out not really well off. They've only been renting land. They're working really hard, but they don't have a lot of money. The only reason they're able to make this move to Salem Village is because by this point, it's 1678, so 14 years before the witch hunt. Their children are just about grown. They are going to move onto that land in one house, but then 3 of their children who've been married are going to build 3 other houses. So it's kind of immediately split into 4 families. You have 4 households paying the bills, farming the land, because it's a lot of land to farm. And so it's really like a group effort that allows them to do this. One misinterpretation that I had found through my research is, especially in the 1800s, people who wrote about the witch hunt kind of saw this as a sign of Rebecca Nurse being later accused of witchcraft out of like jealousy or envy. Like, she had a 300-acre farm, doing pretty well, could be a target of jealousy. It really doesn't seem to be true. Within years, they fell behind on their mortgage payments, and they were sued, so it was public knowledge. They also will fall behind on their taxes, like property taxes to Salem Village, which is read out every year publicly at the town meeting. So like, people knew that they were struggling and not really a target of envy. With the Nurse family's farm, I've kind of zoomed into the middle. They are here, and they're not too far off from the center of Salem Village. Salem Village had been and sort of continued to be part of what's today the city of Salem. It's part of Salem. And they had been trying to split off for a long while. Kind of a lot of reasons why. Number one, it's a long walk to get to downtown Salem, and that's the most practical answer. You'd have to do that every Sunday to go to church, and that was really annoying. So by the time the Nurse family moved out there, the village has its own church. It has its own self-government. It's mostly separate, but not 100%. With this new community, they fall in very well. Her husband will be elected to the village committee, which is basically the selectmen. Because they're not officially a town, they don't use the word selectmen, but he'll basically be one of the selectmen of Salem Village. Her sons will have positions such as, being chosen as laying out roads for the village. Really tiny government back then, but you had these positions, especially as villages grew. So they seem to fit in very well. They're attending services. This is the home on their farm that still exists today. So this is one they moved into in 1678 and where she lived during the time of the witch hunt. It's bigger today. Her family lives there for about 200 years, so they add on. In her day, it would have just been the part, like the door to the right, kind of just 2 rooms. And it is the only home of a victim of the witch hunt that's open to the public, that's preserved like as a museum. Despite things seeming to go well, we will have problems right before the witch hunt in particular. So prior to the Nurse family arriving and that new church being set up in Salem Village, it hadn't really been going very well. The villagers are really prone to arguments and fights over their church for every reason you can imagine. First of all, your Salem Village taxes went to support that church. That was the reason Salem Village got its own little local government when it got its own church, because it's tax supported, the Congregational Church, the Puritan Church at that point. Reverend Parris is the minister during the witch hunt, and he's their 4th minister. The first 3 were all basically run out of town or quit in a huff over issues having to do not so much with religion. There were some that people had issue with the way that they preached. It was really more like personal conflicts. A lot of it is their contract of how much are you going to get paid. Very thrifty New England Puritan village does not want to pay their minister a lot. And you'll have issues, for example, where there was one previous minister who hadn't actually been getting paid as promised, and he couldn't even afford a funeral for his wife. He had to borrow money from someone else in Salem Village, who then later sued him to get the money back. And so you have all of these lawsuits and disputes. The Puritans love to sue one another. Very litigious. By the time we get to right before the witch hunt, so 1689, and the witch hunt is 1692, so we're just 3 years ahead of time, Samuel Parris is hired as the Salem Village minister. And this seems very positive at first. When They form a committee to search to hire a new minister. They include people who had been on basically all sides of all of these previous disputes over previous ministers. It really seems like Salem Village comes together. They will pick Reverend Parris. That being said, we don't even know if anyone else applied for the job because Salem Village had gotten such a bad reputation by this point in time. We don't know if there are any other applicants, but they do unanimously choose Reverend Parris. Reverend Parris is not from here. He grew up down in Barbados. His father, uncle, owned a giant plantation of slaves. He had been incredibly wealthy. And he came up here to go to Harvard, and then somehow, despite being an unfortunate and incredibly profitable industry, his family's plantation went bust. So he drops out of Harvard, has to find a real job. His dream of being a merchant is over forever, and he goes into the ministry. He had been accustomed to kind of a high-class life, so when he's applying for the Salem Village job, he negotiates hard. He pushes them hard to get paid well, to get certain things. And Salem Village is this little frontier farming town, really not wealthy in any sort of way, but they're apparently desperate. And they're going to give him almost everything he wants except one thing. In every community, you had a publicly owned meeting house where the church met. And you also, for the minister, had a publicly owned parsonage where the minister lived. Now that parsonage is public land. Whoever the minister was just lives there during their term. It's kind of like the White House. The president doesn't own it. They just live there while they're in office. That's sort of a concept. Well, Reverend Parris wants the deed to that building because being a landowner gave you a certain status in colonial Massachusetts, and he doesn't want to be a tenant. He's used to owning things. And they say no. That is their common public land. They're not going to give it up. They kind of assuage his ego, I guess. Some guy deeds him an empty field in Salem Village, so now he's a landowner. He owns an empty field. It's fairly useless, but he can claim he's a landowner. And this parsonage site is going to be really important. This is all that remains of it today. It's just the foundations of the building. The building is lost right around the time of right after the revolution, at least around here. The 1780s, the building is taken down. Parris doesn't get it. Doesn't get the deed, starts preaching. We have about 2.5 years that go by. Well, 1689, 1690, 1691, things are smooth and stable for the first time. But we know it's not going to continue that way because the witch hunt is approaching. The fall of 1691, only a few months before the first strange and weird happenings in Salem Village, which occur in January and February of 1692. So the previous fall, this issue boils up again, and in a way that really fractures the community. So just like a town now, all decisions are made by a town meeting, a gathering of all the voters, which back then was only men, of course, but all the voters would gather and vote on the village, like appropriating money, what the taxes would be, laying out roads, whatever. And you had one person who kept the big book, who wrote down every decision, like the village clerk. He wrote down every decision that had been made. Sure, they're moving from one village clerk to another, passing the book to a different guy, and they want to audit it, make sure all the pages are there. Back then, books, they're not really well bound, pages fall out, things get out of order, so they want to make sure it's all good. When they pass it to the new guy, they find something that nobody's ever heard of before. That there had been a town meeting shortly after Parris moved to Salem Village. Now, nobody remembers the town meeting happening, which is a very bad sign to start with. You can't have a secret town meeting here. Everybody would have had to know about it. And at that town meeting, there's only one thing written in that was voted on. And it says that all of Salem Village voted to give Reverend Parris that land that he had wanted all along. Well, now you have this whole village that is enraged because they think this public land has been stolen from them, which it kind of has. And we don't know who wrote it in the book. It's not Reverend Parris' handwriting. We have a lot of examples of that. So we know it's not him, but it had to be someone who was, an ally of him. And at this point in time, they will call what has to be, one of the angriest town meetings ever to determine what do we do about this. So we're in November of 91, going into, they'll have two, going into the first week of December. And what happens is they summon Reverend Parris to come to their town meeting. He doesn't normally attend. He's basically like village employee, more so than like voter. And what they do is they tell him that we're canceling your contract. We're not going to pay you anymore because you've pulled a fast one on us. You've ripped off our community. We are done with you. That's good and all, except that doesn't actually mean he's fired. With the Puritans, nothing is easy or simple, especially when it comes to the church. So the village taxes pay for the minister. So he's been told, we're not paying you anymore. Like, your contract is canceled. But only the members of the church can pick a minister, and they keep him. So he has the job, but he's told he's never going to get paid for it again. You think most people would leave? Like, find a job that's going to pay you? Yeah. He must have been incredibly stubborn or something. He stays. And he still has some, very few, but enough supporters in the church that they're not going to fire him. It's strange. He has to go around begging for firewood, for supplies, because this is December. Winter in New England is approaching, and he has a family in this parsonage to feed, to clothe, to keep warm. He moved in with his wife, several children, 2 enslaved people, and when we get to January and then into February, you do have a household that may or may not seemingly make it through this winter. Remembering that at this point in time, winters were actually far worse than our experience of a winter. There's a little like dip in the climate back then. There are examples of people talk about like Boston Harbor freezing shut, like things that just like would kind of be beyond our understanding of like a normal winter. At this point in time, January, February 1692, the 2 young children in his household start to behave strangely. We have Abigail Williams, who's his adopted niece, who's 9 and who's 11, and then Betty Parris, who's 9, his daughter. They start to have like what looks like seizures. They fall on the ground, they scream, they roll around. It's like something is hurting them, but there's nothing there. It's very unusual and very strange, and it continues. It gets worse and worse. They say they start to see things, and that these images, these ghostly shapes, they call them specters. They say that that's what's hurting them, and that's why they're like flinching and moving around, because they're trying to avoid being hurt. They'll go around on all fours barking like a dog, crawling under furniture, yelling, shrieking. At one point, the 11-year-old Abigail Williams runs into a lit fireplace and tries to like climb up the chimney as she's standing in the flames, and 2 adults run over and like yank her out of the fireplace. Wow. So beyond what one would imagine and truly frightening. This is weird. And kind of going back to different interpretations of the witch hunt, some people, especially if you watch like television programs, always make Reverend Parris into the bad guy. He's not a good guy. But there's some, I think of like films that try to portray him as, like the puppet master of this. He's getting people to accuse people to help. No, this isn't pre-planned, and if anything, it's bad for him. He's trying to get his job back. Having the weirdest thing that anybody's ever heard of happening in his house is not going to help him get his job back. This is not in his benefit. And he tries to keep it quiet for a few weeks and kind of succeeds, and then it spreads, which is one of the more interesting parts, to other teenage young women older than 9 and 11, who live, some vaguely close to him, but others all the way across Salem Village. There'll be some who live on what's today the far eastern border of Salem Village, like the Danvers-Beverly line. Some that live in what's today like the Middleton-Andover line, which would be like 2 towns over from Danvers. So far and wide, and it's very strange, and they're very similar to this sort of almost like seizures. And at that point, the cat's out of the bag. Everybody hears about this. It's the craziest thing they've ever heard of. Like, word travels fast. They're going to call several doctors, and it's one of the doctors who says it's witchcraft. that they had gone through all of their medical knowledge, their giant Latin books, and they found nothing that makes sense. They rule out things like epilepsy that, could cause a seizure and such. And so one of them says they're under an evil hand, which means witchcraft. And that kind of changes it to what you probably more think of as the witch hunt, which is the idea of accusations. The Puritans had a very particular belief in witchcraft, which was it doesn't happen. Someone has to do it to you. So the moment he says witchcraft, they start questioning these young women. And by this point, it's not just teenage women, it's women in their 20s, adult mothers in their mid-30s who are also having these fits. It quickly gains in age. It's not just a bunch of 9-year-olds, which is also a way it's sort of portrayed in some movies. And they're asking them, well, you say you saw a specter. Like, is it someone you know? Are there any clues? Investigatory questions. And they're unwilling to name anybody. It really does not seem pre-planned. It does not seem that this is some sort of fake excuse at the beginning here. They are not willing to accuse anybody. They continue to be unwell or have these fits, though. And eventually weeks go by of them being questioned. And it almost, we wish we had slightly more paperwork in this early stage. The first 3 people they do accuse just so fit the mold of what a Puritan would think that we almost wonder if the adults suggested names to them. It is so on the line that historians have gone through things that what statistically would make somebody more likely to be accused of witchcraft. Number one is being a woman. That is the vast majority of witchcraft accusations in colonial New England. Other things are fights with the church, fights with your family, fights with the government, fights with the neighborhood, just general disputes. And with these first 3, the first person is a woman named Tituba. She's one of the enslaved people that lived with Reverend Parris, literally in the room where it all started. That's suspicious alone. Never mind the fact that she's, not a white Puritan. She's not originally Puritan or Christian to begin with. She came with him from Barbados, but she was from somewhere in Southern or Central America. We're not actually really positive. After her is Sarah Good, someone who was basically a beggar, essentially homeless, not really well liked. The Puritans also believed that being poor itself was a punishment from God, so not sympathetic to those who are not well off in society. In fact, kind of viewed that as a punishment. So that would have made her more suspicious. And then there's someone named Sarah Good who had a lot of disputes with her family. Her husband had recently passed away, and she really quickly married their live-in servant. People kind of thought, that was a little quick, with something going on when her husband was still alive. So family scandals. And when these 3 people are accused, it's amazing how everybody does immediately assume that they're guilty. That is a real hallmark of the witch hunt here, is the idea that once you're accused, way before you ever go to a trial, everybody thinks you've done it. Your first step is being questioned by the judges. Like today, you might see on the nightly news an arraignment. Right after somebody's arrested, they're deciding do we bail you out? Do we hold you in jail until trial? Just that level of decision. They're going to send everybody to jail. They're not going to let anyone out on bail. And right at those instances, we have 2 judges that come to Salem Village. Judge Hathorne, the ancestor of Nathaniel Hawthorne, the writer, and Judge Corwin, whose house is called the Witch House in Salem. With our records, it's amazing the way that they start these questionings. This is an example, an opportunity for the accused person to say, I didn't do it. It wasn't me. This isn't, should touch the microphone. This isn't real. And they say this, of course, because they're not actually doing any magic against anybody. But the first question of their hearing, I think, reveals it all. Judge Hathorne starts all of them, worded slightly differently, but the question is always, how long have you been a witch? Not, are you a witch, or what do you think of this accusation? It's, how long have you been a witch? He's already made up his mind before he's ever asked you a single question. So with these early cases, and there'll be another one, Martha Corey of Peabody, they're sent to jail to await trial. It's amazing how their guilt is assumed way before trial. Rebecca Nurse is number 5. Now, she doesn't at all fit that mold. She's well liked by her neighbors who will support her after she's accused. Great relations with her family. They all support her. Important member of the church. Never had, I don't know, disputes with the government or anything like that. And absolutely does not fit the mold of someone who's accused of witchcraft. And that is why I picked her as the one to write about. I figured the least likely case might actually tell us the most about it. And what we have is with Nurse. One of the early accusers is Mrs. Ann Putnam, who's about 35, and she has several kids. One is her daughter, Ann Putnam Jr. So we have 2 Ann. Every generation named the next generation the same names. It's very confusing and kind of annoying. Both Ann Putnams are going to be the main accusers of Rebecca Nurse. They live nowhere near Nurse, pretty far away actually. Still Salem Village, but far away. And what we have is little Ann Putnam. It says that she is attacked by the specter, and it's someone she doesn't know. Her family asks her, okay, well, like, have you met them? What do you think? And then she's like, it's someone who sits in the same pew as my grandmother for church services in the meeting house. Now, the Puritans sat by sex and age, so everybody in her grandmother's pew would have been an older woman. Her grandmother was one of the oldest people in Salem Village at that point in time. It's nothing that leads you to Rebecca Nurse directly. You'd have like 7 people in one of those pews, so like there's a variety here. And then eventually someone tells her, is it Rebecca Nurse? Someone in the Putnam family. And it is just taken up that once there's this example of an unknown accusation and Rebecca Nurse, suddenly others say it. Similar had happened with the first 4 people. One person had accused Sarah Good, and suddenly all of them accused Sarah Good. It's just that once somebody said Rebecca Nurse's name out loud, they went with it. There was no reason. Ann Putnam apparently didn't even recognize Rebecca Nurse. Talk about not knowing your victim or not having anything against them. There's no reason at all here. And what's fascinating is after Nurse is accused, Nurse's son and one of the sons-in-law goes to the Putnam family's house and tries to figure out, like, who was the first one? Like, where did the accusation come from? And they all point at one another saying, I didn't say her name first, you did. No, I didn't say it first, you. So we have this, we have the moment it happened, but we can't figure out who in that household was the first one to have actually suggested to Ann Putnam Jr., maybe it was Rebecca Nurse. Once all these accusations start as a rumor, before anyone ever fills out paperwork to actually accuse you. Her husband is on the case. Her husband hears the rumor out in Salem Village. She is home sick. When she's arrested for witchcraft, she says she hasn't left the house in 8 or 9 days. She's been ill in bed. It's something to do with her stomach. We don't really know what, specifically. So she has not been involved in anything that's going on. Her husband decides he is not going to be the one to tell her that she's been accused of witchcraft. He has a better idea. He invites friends who, one is a selectman in Salem, others were previously elected to important positions, respected people in the community to come to the house. They will tell her, and they will write down her reaction as a deposition to use in court. Francis Nurse is not a lawyer. You don't really have lawyers in Massachusetts at that point. He himself was part of those litigious Puritans. He had sued a bunch of people had sued him over the years. He knows how the court works and wants to win. So he's smart in this sense. And what we have is a document that states Nurse being utterly shocked that she's been accused of witchcraft. She says she's been very sympathetic towards those who are unwell. She doesn't say if she believes it's witchcraft or not, but she does say she believes they're being hurt by something, and she's been praying for them, doesn't really understand, and so she's shocked that she had been so sympathetic to those who were unwell or afflicted, as they call it, that she would be next. Despite that, a warrant is sworn out. She's arrested at the Nurse homestead. She's then brought to the tavern in Salem Village, which still exists just as like a private house today. She's kept there till Hathorne and Corwin, the judges, can ride out from downtown Salem. And then she has her appearance before them in the Salem Village Meeting House. This is a copy at the Rebecca Nurse homestead. They tore down the original around 1700, but we still have the plans. So they built this for a movie, but it looks exactly as it would have. So you would have had the two judges sitting up front, Nurse standing in front of them, and then like all of Salem Village in the pews behind her. With these hearings, I mentioned the assumed guilt. Nurses seems like it could go different. She's well respected. The judges would have probably known her when she lived in downtown Salem. And they give her opportunities almost like off-ramps in their questions. They start by saying, how long have you been a witch, as they always had, unfortunately. But she's so convincing in her answers that at one point Hathorne asks her, I'm paraphrasing here, but the gist of it is, you've explained that well, like, if it's not witchcraft, what else might it be? Like, they're trying to find a way that it might not be her in their questions, which is unique among those who are accused. The problem is, the moment they let up, guess who else is in the crowd in the meeting house is her accusers. They fall into their fits, they're screaming on the floor, rolling, and then the judges go right back to their hard questions. Mrs. Putnam, the 35-year-old, has to be carried out by her husband because her fit is so awful that like they can't hear the questions, like it's actually disrupting the like legal process. And then the moment she's carried through the door of the meeting house outside, she's perfectly fine. The moment she crosses the threshold. With this, Nurse is sent to jail in Boston. Well, first Salem, then Boston, then back to Salem. Her arrest was in March. Her trial isn't until June. These jail conditions are awful. As I mentioned, we have at least 5 people who died in jail, all of whom are basically in better shape than Rebecca Nurse in terms of being healthier and younger. So it's kind of amazing that she actually lives through these jails. They're full of rats. They're not really heated, and in the summer they're way too hot. You're overcrowded. Everything is always wet, and it's not water. It's awful. It's gross. It's terrible. We will have her on trial in June. Her family, especially her husband, is collecting evidence for her trial while she's in jail. You didn't really have lawyers back then, but you could have an agent, like somebody to speak for you on your behalf at trial. Because when you're in a jail cell, how are you collecting evidence to defend yourself? You can't go around talking to people. You can't collect pieces of paper. You're stuck in a jail cell. So you needed someone on the outside. He has petitions of all these people saying she's a good person, depositions of saying nice things about her, but also like attacking the accusers, like pointing out times, that person's a known liar. They've lied, in these cases before. And it really like attack as a form of defense, which is really effective. One of the accusers, Paris's niece, Abigail Williams, will never testify in court again because the Nurse family has like ruined her reputation at Rebecca Nurse's trial. So like it's effective. And some of those we have weird ways that families split. Here we have a house in Danvers. It's known as General Israel Putnam's house. You might remember him from Bunker Hill, Don't Fire Till You See the Whites of Their Eyes. His father is involved in the witch hunt. He's not born until like 20 years afterwards, but his father is. His father is half-brother to the Putnam family that's accused Nurse, but he defends Nurse. It's fascinating the way you have families split. You have families who, as there's more accusations, some will support their family member, and some will absolutely distance themselves from their family member because they're afraid they'll be accused next. So it is important that the Nurse family sticks up for her because they easily could have been accused as the next person. What we have with Nurse goes to trial in June. The best defense evidence out of any of those accused in 1692 by miles. The jury at this point has a perfect conviction rate. They've already hung and executed Bridget Bishop at the beginning of June for witchcraft. Then at Nurse's session, it's like a week long, the court met. They did 6 trials in a week. All of those before Nurse is up, all guilty verdicts. it's just that the evidence against them is believed. There's no other way to explain these fits than witchcraft. There's no way for them to understand it other than that. And so it really isn't, innocent until proven guilty. It's how do you disprove that accusation? And you logically sort of can't. With Nurse, though, the jury hears the evidence. They listen, they leave, and they come back with a not guilty verdict that is sort of like an earthquake in the witch hunt. Because the evidence against Nurse was no different than the evidence against all those others. So if the jury says Nurse is not guilty, what about all those other people that they had already convicted? So this is a shocking moment. You can imagine in the courthouse in downtown Salem, the afflicted accusers break out into fits. The judges in particular are sort of flabbergasted. One of them says they're going to indict her and try her again. They hadn't actually charged at trial. They weren't trying all of the charges against her because 6 people had accused her. They were actually only trying 4. So yes, in theory, she could have been put on trial again because it was a different accusation, even though that, feels wrong in a lot of ways. What ends up happening is the Chief Justice asks the jury to reconsider, which he could do, but they could also say no. They don't say no because he says something happened at trial that where they were sitting, he didn't think that they heard. They missed a piece of evidence. What happened is in the room, Nurse is standing up front, the judge is in front of her, and down back is the door where they're bringing in witnesses and such. And at one point, 2 women come in, and Nurse turned around, and it's written 3 different ways, but the gist of it is she turns around and says, "Why did they come here? Isn't she one of us?" It's someone who's in jail with Rebecca Nurse. And if you're charged for the same crime, you're not supposed to testify against one another. That's a no-no. So Nurse thought this was fishy. What she didn't know was that person had falsely confessed to being a witch. So the Chief Justice says, "Isn't she one of us? What do you mean by one of us?" Insinuating that Rebecca Nurse just confessed to witchcraft by saying one of us. Which obviously is not what was meant by that. The jury is still not sold. They redeliberate, they come back, and they're still not sold, but they want to ask Rebecca Nurse directly, what did you mean by that question? As I mentioned, she's 71. She had been really ill before spending 4 months in jail. That would have been terrible. She's had to stand for hours. You had to stand for your entire trial back then. And she was hard of hearing as well. And so when they come back to ask her questions, she half answers them, but doesn't quite hear the question, it seems. And the jury thinks it's a dodge. So they will convict her in the end. Her family, you can imagine, is extra livid because they thought that she had been acquitted. They appeal to the governor, who grants a reprieve, saying he's going to wait to execute her so she can appeal. And then all we know is 2 Salem gentlemen, that's the way it's written, so we don't know their names, basically get to the governor, and he takes away the repeal, and she's executed July 19th, with the other 5 women who were put on trial that week. Nurse's family will support other people who were accused of witchcraft throughout that year. There'll be another round of executions in August. August 19th, which is today, is an anniversary. Then in September. And then the court was going to meet again in October, and the court will fall. The governor will stop it because of public pressure. People writing letters, people speaking out against it. You can imagine if you're average man, woman in Salem Village, you might believe this, you might not believe this, but if they accuse your mother or your sister, you're going to become an opponent pretty quickly. So the more people they accuse, the more opponents there are. So it really is public pressure that brings this to an end. With Nurse, the last thing I wanted to mention really briefly is the way that this is remembered, because she's remembered after 1692 uniquely and differently than the others. We have in Danvers, there's still the First Church, the same church that was there in 1692. You can imagine, one can't imagine after the witch hunt ends, a town trying to go back together, and like maybe the guy on the farm next to you was the one who accused your mother of witchcraft. How do you go back to farming your fields next to that guy? How do you ever like put this back together? It stopped because people knew it was wrong, but that doesn't mean anybody ever like apologizes right away. Only one of the judges ever will. The accusers never quite. There's one who sort of does. She publicly stands up and says the devil made her do it. Really not an apology, like you're not taking any responsibility. That was Ann Putnam Jr. Who did that. And we have, for example, the accusers kind of disappear. Many of them were unmarried women, and so their name changes, and we don't know where they went, or they're hard to find. Nurse's two main accusers in the Putnam family are buried without a marker, just in a mound in Danvers. That's the family cemetery that the Putnam family still uses. There was someone buried there like 2 months ago, actually, so still active. But there's no sort of marker there. Nurse is the first one to get a memorial in her name. Her descendants continued to live on her farm. Her descendants in the 1700s got her name cleared officially. Doesn't really do her any good at that point, but officially her name is cleared. In 1885, they put up this monument to her. It's not just important for like Salem. They say it's the first monument to anybody who was ever convicted of witchcraft, like anywhere. I think that's incredibly hard to prove. But yeah, it's a like real historical event. We have front page of the Boston Globe, and you might think, well, actually first before that. So this is what the monument actually looks like. It's a little granite, Rockport granite, good North Shore granite. That's how the Globe people drew it. It's like 3 times as tall. I don't know what they're doing. Maybe they're trying to fill space or something. But this is not just in the Globe. It's in newspapers in London, in Paris, in Australia. This idea that it's the first time someone who had been convicted of witchcraft is like memorialized. There are newspapers out west from the Dakota Territory that have this. I found one out in Minnesota. There was like a German language newspaper, and because like that's where a lot of German immigrants had moved to in America. That this is very widely, it's like a world historic sort of moment here. That's 1885. It's not until 1992 that all of the others get a memorial. This is the first one in Salem Village in Danvers, and then they build one in downtown Salem too. So she's more than 100 years ahead of time, that there was something about her story that was so compelling that led people to do that, not just like to support her at the time, but even the generations afterwards. They sort of, she is the one that they focus in on. And if you've ever read The Crucible by Arthur Miller, Rebecca Nurse is an important part of that in the 1950s as well. So kind of every generation, just because of how she was the least likely, most unexpected case that it could have been. And that is what brought me to research that topic. That's what I have for you. I'd be happy to take any questions, but I appreciate you coming out to hear about a really early event in American history. So thank you for coming.